This is the Triage Method podcast with me, Gary McGowan, and my co-host, Patrick Farrell. For those of you who are new around here, we are Triage Method. That's the name of our business. We're a coaching and education business. We focus on all things related to health and fitness. We generally take more of a, health-focused approach to the process of improving one's body, improving one's performance, etc. Or at least we like to think that. But this is our podcast. And Paddy, before we get into things, how are you this week?
As per usual, I am positively fantastic, Gary. Could not be better. Well, I actually could be better if we were allowed to do some jiu-jitsu. But look, that's supposedly, which is actually funny because I was listening to our last podcast that we recorded, which came out on a Thursday, which is probably 2 weeks behind now. But anyway, look, that's beside the point. We were saying in it, like, oh, I hope we were basically slagging you, being like, oh, I hope the place doesn't close down in Cork and Kerry. And literally the next day, well, not the next,
Gone.
they were like, see you later. So yeah,
Gone.
we're still under lockdown, well, quasi lockdown. It's not great, but look, it is what it is. Anyway, no jiu-jitsu. When that comes back, I'll be a happy camper. But yeah, what are we going to talk about today, Gary?
Yes, today we're talking about diet history, which is an interesting one because a lot of the time what we talk about on the podcast, are various topics related to nutrition, related to diet. And we always bring up these kind of concepts that, there are many different ways that you could potentially have a healthful diet, or there are many different things that we have tried. But what we've never really done is actually gone through the different things, the different steps in our own evolution in terms of nutrition. Obviously, we could do the exact same thing as it relates to training, but today we're going to focus on nutrition. So what I would like people to get from this podcast is to look at, the evolution of where we entered the fitness industry, you could say, or just the process of improving our nutrition. We both have different starting points, but I'm sure there'll be some common points as well. So that you can kind of, regardless of where you are on that spectrum, you could be, day one, just trying to sort out your nutrition listening to this podcast, or you could be a seasoned veteran, you're a trainer for 10 years or whatever. But I'm sure you'll be able to identify certain relatable points along the way. And hopefully, if we do discuss the different steps and the decisions we made, maybe you can avoid potentially making some of the mistakes, if there are mistakes along those steps. So for
And
me
also,
anyway,
just
go
on
ahead.
that as well, I think it's also important that people realize that it's not like we just woke up one day and we knew
No.
everything about nutrition. Like, it is a process. Because like we were just talking about this in terms of what our business, because we always do a little bit of a business review before we do these podcasts, in case you were wondering. But we were just talking about the growth of our business over the next few years. And it is the same in terms of how you build nutritional knowledge or training knowledge or health knowledge or whatever it is. Like, you can look at these companies, or in this case, these other individuals that have all their nutrition together, have all their stuff together. And you can be like, oh, Jesus, I don't know as much as them, or I can't do what they do, but in reality, it's like, well, like, you don't see the 10 years that built up to that point, So I know a lot of younger coaches especially listen to this, and they're kind of in a position where they're like, oh Jesus, like, they seem to be talking about all this stuff, and there's a lot of extra stuff that I hadn't even considered. And that's perfectly okay. Like, you're not going to know everything straight off the bat, and this is if you're a coach yourself, and obviously if you are just trying to get in better shape overall. It's like, you're not going to have things perfect from the start. And even you think right now you have everything perfect, like, realistically it's probably not. There's probably something that is going to change in the future, either with your life, with your goals, or whatever, or your approach itself might change. You might learn new information, or have access to better tools that allow you to manipulate different variables. For example, like, when we grew up, there wasn't really like activity tracking watches, so like that component of, we'll call it nutrition or lifestyle or whatever you want to call it, where it's like you're able to manipulate the amount of steps that you take per day. Like, that wasn't really easily accessible. Like, yeah, you could buy a pedometer, but like, most people weren't. And now it's like, yeah, your phone does that. Oh yeah, your watch does that. It's just easy. So in the future, your approach could change with technological advances, and obviously, the more knowledge you learn. But basically, I wanted to state that we didn't come to knowledge just straight out the gate, and neither will you, you know?
Yeah, and I think a good way to kind of introduce this conversation is to realize that your perspective on nutrition or your perspective on the world in general is going to be shaped by where you started out. So, for example, someone coming into bodybuilding is going to have a different perspective of what nutrition means versus someone coming into endurance training, let's say. Just like if you're from a farming house in rural Ireland, you're going to have a very different perspective on the world from someone in a penthouse apartment in New York. And if you were to discuss different social issues, you're going to have very different perspectives on those things because of where you came from. It's, you have a different way of looking at the world. And when it comes to nutrition, if you've come into nutrition from the perspective of bodybuilding, okay, your initial goal, and this was kind of my goal, and this is why it's relatable. Like when I got into nutrition first, my goal was, okay, I want to build muscle. I want to get bigger. I want to be less skinny. I was quite skinny. I didn't have much muscle. I was very weak. I still don't. I was very weak. Still am. But my fundamental goal was, okay, I have to get heavier. I have to get bigger. I have to get stronger. So my decisions as they related to nutrition were related solely to that. Whereas if someone was coming into nutrition from the perspective of an endurance athlete who is weight neutral in their approach, in that they're not thinking about weight as even being a variable, they're just thinking about performance, then the variables that they begin to look at are very different. And then obviously if someone's coming in and they're they have obesity, they're unfit, their primary goal is just to lose weight to improve certain biomarkers of health, let's say, because maybe their doctor has had some concerns, then again, they're looking at nutrition from a different perspective. Okay, so for me, when I first got into managing my nutrition, my sole goal was I want to build muscle. I want to get stronger. That was pretty much it. So as a result, like, where did I go? I went to places like bodybuilding.com, looked at the forums there. Bodybuilding.com used to and still do have a lot of like sample diet plans, and there'd be like Chris Gethin's like shortcut to size and those types of things, or 12-week body transformation, and just looking at what people were saying about those things, what was on the forums. The bodybuilding.com forums used to be a really popular place of discussion. Other places like T Nation and other bodybuilding related websites, and YouTube as well was actually a big thing for me. I used to watch a lot of YouTube videos of like days of eating of bodybuilders and see what they'd be eating and stuff. And as a result, you kind of come across these very common themes when you look at all of those places, or at least you did back then. When I say back then, like it's only like 7 or 8 years ago. It's not that long ago.
In fairness, the fitness industry is completely different than when
it's changed a lot. Yeah.
Like I'm still basically like half a generation before you as well.
Yeah,
so
yeah.
my experience is even different again, but go on anyway.
Yeah, I'm 25. What age are you? 28, 29?
29 in January.
29 in January. There you go. So I'm 25. So I initially kind of got into, I suppose, the gym / managing my nutrition at 16, I think. Yeah, around 16 or so. So 9 years. God, I made pretty poor progress for 9 years of training, but here we are. Anyway, so yeah, back in the day, bodybuilding.com forums were actually a very popular place of discussion. And a lot of the people that you actually see as like thought leaders in nutrition now, they actually would have been in those forums and discussing these things. And even before that, in the 90s, when I was only a little kiddo, this is where a lot of people used to have those conversations before Facebook, before Twitter, Instagram, etc. So that's what I did. And as a result, I kind of came out with this, typical bodybuilding approach of, I'm going to eat clean foods and I'm going to eat a lot of them. All right. That was my approach. I didn't initially start tracking calories. I think I came across the whole, like, if it's your macro / flexible dieting thing, probably sooner into my training career or nutrition career than a lot of people do. But initially it was just a case of, I'm going to eat clean foods and I'm going to eat a lot of them. And my idea of clean foods were things like various meats. It was mainly like chicken and mince and steak that I would eat. I gradually started to expose myself to eggs at that time because I saw so many bodybuilders eating eggs that I was like, I can't not eat eggs. So I started eating eggs. I used to drink pints of milk with my meals.
We should actually, just before we get into this, we should also just do a little quick primer in terms of your childhood as well, in terms of your exposure to nutrition up until the point there, because like you're saying, I exposed myself to eggs.
Yeah.
It's like for a lot of people, it would have been like, yeah, I had eggs on a weekly. But obviously this goes into like your socioeconomic status, etc. Obviously, everyone comes from a different position. But what was your childhood experience with nutrition like? Now, obviously, don't fucking start off and be like, because if you do this, I'll kill you. You're like, oh well, I actually was breastfed at first, and then I went on to solid food. But anyway, go on.
Um, yeah, like my mom always says to me that I was actually a great child when I was quite young for eating. That I used to eat like everything. I used to eat salmon and fish and everything when I was small before I can remember, and now I just about eat salmon. But as I kind of got into later into my childhood, I think I was a bit more of a fussy eater. But I don't think I was that bad, to be honest. Like I just used to have some weird things. Like I just stopped eating seafood. I didn't eat steak for whatever reason. Like I'd eat burgers, I'd eat mince, but I just didn't eat steak. I don't know why not.
Which is
I did.
blasphemy if you're from Kerry.
Yeah, it is, isn't it? And I didn't eat eggs. I stopped eating milk. I stopped eating butter. I don't know why, but it was like there was some sort of aversion to dairy that I started to develop. I do have this one memory actually of someone making butter popcorn in my house one time and just being absolutely disgusted by the smell of it. And I don't think I went back eating butter after that. And my dad actually had a similar experience in his childhood. He had a teaspoon of butter one time, and he just wasn't able to eat it since. So anyway, there you go. I don't think I was like very conscious of trying to eat healthy as a child or even as a teenager. Like that wasn't a thing. My mom, to be fair, always made great dinners and good school lunches and everything, but very much normal, like a ham sandwich or whatever in your lunchbox kind of job. Bit of fruit, maybe a little chocolate bar if you were lucky. But I think that was actually banned in my primary school. In my primary school, we weren't allowed to have like sweets or anything like that. Very
Yeah,
tyrannical.
I,
But
I wasn't either.
yeah,
They were like,
yeah.
I
So
went, I went to a national school and they were like mixed.
yeah.
And like, oh, well, you can't be showing your wealth or fucking whatever. You can't bring a chocolate bar. We used to just go to the shop across the road from the school and rob chocolate bars in case anyone was wondering how we got
Yeah.
it.
So yeah, I think I used to get like one of those the winders, the fruit winders. I used to get one of those because they were kind of like on that edge of like your sweet treat and whatever. But then as a teenager, I think my diet probably like degenerated a little bit up until I was about 16, because as I had more freedom in terms of spending my money in the shop and stuff, because I first had a job when I was like 12, so I was working since I was 12, and I as a result I had money and I was able to go and I used to love Subway. I used to have a lot of Subway. Not that that's that bad, although I hear since last week Subway bread is no longer regarded as bread. But
That's purely their own fault. Just as an aside, in case anyone's wondering about that, that was Subway trying to get off from paying any taxes because they're like, oh, bread is an essential item, so you don't get
yeah.
taxed on it. So that's the whole reason behind that. But anyway, that's beside the point.
Yeah, there you go. But yeah, so as I moved into kind of like my early teens, and I got more freedom, probably I used to buy more sweets, buy more chocolate, buy more like McDonald's. I have a specific McDonald's is really close to my house, like right next to my house at home. So I used to actually eat a lot of McDonald's, anytime I had a bit of money. And I remember when I was in transition year, I was 16 at the time, and it was the first time you were able to get like a debit card. So you get your first debit card. And I just remember the novelty of me and all the lads going up to McDonald's and just putting it in and buying like a load of nuggets and a load of cheeseburgers and stuff, whatever. But yeah, so like I definitely didn't pay much attention. I wasn't overweight, to be honest. I was always kind of out and about. Like I lived in a housing estate, so like you're kind of just always around doing something, messing, playing soccer or whatever. So yeah, I wasn't overweight or anything, but my mom was still always very good in terms of like being like, just eat your breakfast, stop being stupid, sit down, eat your dinner, that kind of thing. Standard kind of Irish upbringing. But from there anyway, as I moved on and I first got into training, into the gym, and I started to see all these foods that other people were eating, I wanted to expose myself to more of those types of foods. So I started trying things like steak. I started trying eggs. I wanted to have more dairy in my diet. And obviously then as a result, stopped eating as much kind of junk food, I remember when I was big into playing Call of Duty Modern Warfare 2, as I'm sure many people were. I used to always have like a bottle of Cherry Lucozade or a big carton of orange juice. And what else did we eat? There was like 39-cent packets of Jaffa Cakes that you could get in Tesco. So you'd just buy a couple of packets of them. And chili Doritos were a big thing then as well. So yeah, they were like our snacks for when we used to be playing Call of Duty. So certainly not your kind of athlete upbringing who was trying to eat really healthy. But as I got into the gym, as I said, started to expose myself to more of those foods, got into the kind of more clean eating type of approach. And when I was in like sixth year, so my final year of secondary school, for those who aren't from Ireland, that's pretty much the same as like American high school, is it? I know it's a
Yeah.
little bit different, but similar. Yeah. So basically, the end of high school, you could say, if we have American listeners. Um, so I was about 17 then, and what I used to do was my mom was very good, to be fair, when I started to get into the gym, because she was kind of like, well, he could be doing worse things. So she'd like cook me a few chicken breasts in the morning and like just put on a lot of rice or whatever. And I used to have this massive lunchbox full of like 3 chicken breasts and probably like 500 grams of rice, to be honest. Probably like a little bit of barbecue sauce on it on top if I was being good to myself. And I'd have a load of those Nature Valley granola bars, 2 or 3 of those in the bag. I might have some additional sandwiches in the bag, and then I might have a few pieces of fruit and whatever else. And I used to carry it around in this Dunn's shopping bag in school, and everyone used to mock me for it. And there's one teacher who used to actually call me Roy Cropper from Coronation Street always carries this bag with him, and that was me in school. I used to carry that bag with me all the time. Was my bag of food and studied then until whatever, I don't know, 7:30 or whatever in the evening in sixth year. And that was me. That was my food for the day. So as I built up those habits of kind of, all right, you have your meals, your food is prepped. That actually stood to me so well when I initially went off to college. And I kind of carried over a lot of those like clean eating type habits then. But as I was probably, when I was in sixth year, I think, or maybe the turn of sixth year, I started to like track my calories and track my macros more. So I'd come across that stuff, and I started to do that. And that was when, I got more into the nutrition science side of things a little bit more, trying to ask more questions, figure out more things. And that was actually very productive for a while. But eventually what I found was that, and this happens with a lot of people, as I got into kind of tracking my calories more and kind of dispelling nutrition myths, I probably like swung to the opposite side of the pendulum for a while. Because what happened was, as I ended up tracking calories more, I maybe had less of a concern for food quality and things like that. So I'd start fitting more junk food into my diet every now and then, and it's probably not the best habit. And there was a while where, I found myself kind of binge eating a bit more, and then maybe I would restrict for a while, and then I binge a bit more and I'd restrict for a while. And I was kind of in that kind of yo-yo phase where I was kind of up and down, because basically I just didn't really have my nutrition very much in order. I was too restrictive for a while, and then I let things swing too far to the other side for a while, and that went on for a while. And eventually, I kind of found this kind of more balanced position, I suppose you could say, of just finding a dietary structure that worked well for me. That was that kind of sweet spot between the clean eating approach, you could say, and the more flexible approach. And that's basically led me up to where I am today. Like, and I think that's a kind of key point here, is that initially you try out more things, but eventually you get to the point where you're on this path of like your own kind of customized approach that you found. And you're like, yeah, I'll tweak things here and there, but the vast majority of my diet, like, is the same most weeks. Like, there's variation, of course, but it tends to be the same most weeks. And in that period of time, that kind of interim period of time, there's been times where I've tried different things. Like, I've done a ketogenic diet for a brief period of time for, I think, about 4 weeks or so. I tried that for a while. The main outcomes of that being that, I felt the kind of the cognitive effects that people discuss as it relates to keto, in terms of maybe having more consistent energy levels, you could say. Hunger not being as much of a problem. But what I did find on keto that I didn't really like was, one, it takes a lot of effort to kind of plan out your meals and stuff, and it's just a lot of hassle for unclear benefits. And two, the other thing was that when I was training, and I was training quite hard at the time, I could never really get into kind of like fourth or fifth gear. I felt like, I could get through my sessions, but I was never able to really push myself, because obviously carbohydrates tend to be pretty helpful for that, particularly as it relates to weight training, especially if you're doing higher rep stuff. So that was kind of my experience with keto. But other than that, I never really had like a vegan phase. I didn't really have any phase with any other kind of extreme diets. I'd done things like carbohydrate cycling and carb backloading and different ways of structuring my calories and intermittent fasting and that type of thing. But overall, like, I would say that my diet has kind of settled to a place over time where the vast majority of the time I'm having 3 main meals per day, maybe an additional snack. My breakfast has probably been the same for 5 years, I would say. I almost always have porridge with blueberries, whey protein, and some dark chocolate on top. Like, that's really been so consistent. And even outside of that, like, a lot of my meals do tend to be consistent. And at least when I'm kind of cooking for myself, a lot of the time when I'm cooking for myself, it'll be something like mince or some type of meat, very much like yourself, Patty, vegetables, some sort of beans, and depending on where my calories are at, I might add rice, or I'll add lentils, or maybe I'll put in some olive oil or nuts if I'm really trying to bump up the calories. But yeah, like, I mean, my diet isn't anything too special at the moment, but that's pretty much how I got here. I'm sure there's more details in the meantime, but any comments or trends that are relatable there, Patty?
I think we'll come back at the end and just kind of do a few
Yeah.
different things that we've tried and stuff like that, just so I can get through mine and not make this into a fucking 2 hour.
Yeah, this is a 2 hour podcast.
But basically, like, my upbringing, similar enough in terms of, I was a fine eater when I was younger. Then I did become a little bit more picky, especially like my parents always say, like, I used to be like, I would only eat pizza for dinner. Like, they used to like sell these little smaller pizzas, like, basically like the size of my hand or something now. And they'd be like, oh, that's basically all I would have, and chips for dinner, and, the typical in Ireland anyway, like, breakfast and lunch when you're in school is like, oh, breakfast is like some sort of cereal, I don't know,
Yeah.
Weetabix, cornflakes. If your parents are especially, on a treat, they'd give you, like, I don't know, Cocoa Pops or something, which never happened in my house because there's so many boys that, well, first of all, they're more expensive, and then the packet would just be gone in a day. So it's not good value when you have like 5 young boys in the house. But anyway, that's beside the point. So, typical breakfast, cereal, milk, that kind of shit. Go to school, you have a little sambo there. Again, as I said, you weren't allowed to have like chocolate and stuff. Like, sometimes, like, they went on and off with banning that stuff, especially, well, they brought it in more towards the end of when I was in primary school. Like, that was kind of like, oh, we want to make sure everyone's equal with their food. And then also, they're like, oh, we want to tackle the obesity crisis and everything. Because, again, like, I went to school in the 90s, so that was only like starting to come to the public awareness,
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, sometimes, like, I was never one that, like, my parents would give us like chocolate bars, again, because there's so many of us. They'd be like, well, this is just not a good return on investment here. But so it would be like, here's your ham sandwich, or here's your cheese sandwich, that's it. But that was that. Then after school, you might have, I don't know, a packet of crisps or something, whatever was knocking around the house. And then for dinner, as I said, like, I literally would be like, I only want pizza. I'd have pizza and chips. That was it. Like, my dad used to have to cook pizza for me. Like, he'd cook everyone else food. He could be having, like, I don't know, spaghetti bolognese or fucking whatever. And I'd be like, no, I just want pizza and chips. And that was literally what I ate, right? And yeah, I got pretty fat. Even though I was doing some sports, and, like, obviously I live in a house full of boys, so there's always like rough housing or out kicking a football or doing whatever. But, like, I liked food. I liked eating food. I liked eating lots of food. And I wouldn't ever say I got like obese, but, like, I definitely wasn't, skinny or lean. Had some fat rolls.
Yeah.
It was quite nice. I enjoyed all the food. I'm not going to say I regretted it. But anyway, then, like, you hit like 12, 13, you kind of get a little bit more body conscious, especially, like, again, I'm a house full of boys. We like watch, I don't know, wrestling. We actually weren't allowed to watch wrestling because, again, house full of boys. But you'd be watching like Dragon Ball Z and stuff like that, and, like, you'd see all like this is the era of like Stallone, Arnold Schwarzenegger, all that kind of stuff. So, like, you'd see them and you'd be like, Jesus, like, humans can look like that, men can look like that. And obviously, you're 12, 13, you're kind of like developing your sense of what it is to be a man and stuff like that. And, like, one of them was like, oh, I wanted to be in better shape. So I started, like, looking into it a bit more. Like, and I discussed this before on our website, in our about section. But, like, I grew up in a house where it was always encouraged to read books and, look at that kind of stuff or consume that kind of content. I really enjoyed watching, like, documentaries and, information. I just liked getting information. So I used to get my parents to get me books on, like, health and nutrition and stuff like that. Now, obviously, they don't know where to get it. So, sometimes we go into the local library and you get a book on whatever, and I'd just be consuming that kind of content. Now, again, some of it was just like actually piss poor and, probably negligent to give to consumers overall, especially if children are going to read it, because like 12, 13, like that is a child basically. But basically looked at my diet a little bit more in depth. But again, like you're a teenager, you don't care that much. However, at the same time, girls are a thing. So wanted to, look good for the girls. So that was another thing. So, probably picked up my training a little bit. And then obviously tidied up my diet in whatever way I was thinking was correct at that time. Like probably, cut out this food and eat a bit more of this food. But I definitely wouldn't say my diet was, good or a healthful diet. I was probably still like, oh yeah, pizza, is it? Yeah, that seems to be a good food, because again, I really like pizza. But then it was really around, I don't know, the year, like third year, like finishing your junior cert. So whatever age that is, what was that, 15, 16, is it? Something 15, like that.
I'd say.
And I think like in Ireland, you were only allowed to join a gym when you were over 16, So I would have to have been 16, because that would make sense, because 16 in January, anyway. So 16, and then me and my friend joined a gym for the summer from between third year and into fourth year, and I basically designed his training program and my training program. Now, again, they're probably fucking pretty terrible, like super high volume and whatever else that was going on. Because again, like I know everyone these days has like easy access to the internet and whatever, but like we had one computer in my house, like I was one of the first, my school was one of the first schools to have like a computer room, like, and they had like, I don't know if people remember, I think it was called Encarta Explorer or something like that. And basically that kind of shit. Anyway, so was looking at stuff online, not knowing where to find stuff. But in that kind of third into fourth year, like you said, Gary, like bodybuilding.com was kind of coming to fruition. At least I think it was around that time that I started, reading a bit more of it. Either way, like it was a combination. Like I didn't really use the internet because you didn't have a phone that could easily access it, and then also I'm not going into my family computer to be looking up like how to build your pecs. Like I didn't know that kind of shit, like, but then into fourth year, like, or I should actually say a few things about that transition period in between third and fourth year. Like we knew like protein was a thing that you were supposed to eat, but like this is in Ireland, like we were like, oh, you're not supposed to be eating like whey protein powders, like they're like steroids and stuff, like because people used to properly like say that stuff. They were like, oh, that's really bad for you, like it's steroids and you shouldn't consume them, and all that kind of stuff. So me and my mate were like, Jesus, like we shouldn't consume them, but like I'd be reading like these articles or whatever, and like we used to think there was some sort of like magic to like whey protein. So like we were reading like men's health things, and one of them was like, oh, ricotta cheese has like a higher percentage of whey protein, and we were like, oh geez, like we'll get that. So we were like hammering that stuff, and like we were like, oh, protein, where do you get that from? And you'd be like, oh, meat, and like, oh, like I don't have any money. Like I had a job when I was 14, so I had some money, like enough to get a gym membership and do all that kind of stuff, but didn't have like excess cash that could be like, oh yeah, here, actually just gonna fucking buy some meat here for my family, like will you cook this for me, because again, like you're whatever 15, 16, you're like cooking food is just not something you did, it's like that's what the your parents do. But so we were like hammering that stuff. After workouts, we were like, oh yeah, beans are cheap, so we'll buy some like beans and have like beans on toast as our post-workout meal, because it's like that has protein in it. Or like we were like, oh, I'll make a ham and cheese toasty, because it's like, oh, there's protein in that, like stuff like that. Like diet was not good by any stretch of the imagination, but it wasn't bad either. It wouldn't be like, oh, that's definitely going to be a great muscle building diet or a fat loss diet or, just healthful diet, but it wasn't a bad diet, And then in fourth year, that was when I was really like, oh, I actually want to get a good bit leaner. And I basically just did that by eating less, like it wasn't any scientific, like, oh, I need this much protein or this much carbs. It was like, as long as I felt a little bit hungry after my meals, I was like, I'm in a good position, That was the kind of diet mentality. I was like, I just want to be a little bit hungry, and happy days then, and stay away from those like high calorie foods that I knew, like sweets and stuff like that. And it was like, I'll get leaner. And I got leaner, you know, I was in great shape, you know, especially because I was doing sports and, you know, we'd started going to the gym. So I built some muscle and whatever else. And so was in a good position from then on. And then I got a little bit more serious with my training. Like I was doing a few different sports and, you know, the sports were going well. And also then I was like, oh, I need to actually, you know, learn a bit more about nutrition because it seems to be important for athletes. So that's what I need to do, you know. And obviously again, like you're getting information from, you know, coaches and stuff. Like I remember one of my boxing coaches was again probably fucking negligent, but like telling us like how he used to cut for his weight class and stuff, you know. And it would be like he'd have like a yogurt and he'd be like, oh, I have like a yogurt for lunch and like stuff like that. It was not like a well thought out diet or at all. It was just like these foods seem to fill him up. So he was like, oh, that obviously makes sense. And, you know, it leads to weight loss, you know? But anyway, look, that's another side discussion. But, you know, diet was not great, but I was learning more all the time, you know, especially like reading like men's health magazines and stuff like that, where you're getting some sort of information. And obviously again, the internet, I'm starting to have more access to it, because it became easier to access it. I'm not really sure at what stage. Like I think it was maybe when I was 18. Yeah, I'd say around 18. So sixth year, going into like first year of college and stuff. Like I started to learn more about nutrition in terms of like I was reading like bodybuilding.com and that kind of stuff. And again, like I started understanding like calories and macros and stuff like that. Still didn't understand that you could be like, oh, I fill this with like bad foods or whatever. Like it was like as a concept, I was still, it's all good foods that you should be eating, you know, like that was what I grew up with. I wanted to be healthy. I wanted to be like, you know, good at sports. So I was like, oh, you eat healthy foods. Like athletes don't eat junk, you know? So I wouldn't say I was counting my macros or calories or anything like that, but I definitely use that as a principle to understand how much I should be eating in terms of like, I would basically make out a diet plan for myself, you know, and I'd be like, I need to consume 4,000 calories or whatever it is. And I need to have this much protein. And it was definitely way too much protein as well. It was like, oh, well, if they say this much is good, like surely this much is better, you know, and it's going to build muscle and, you know, it's great for strength and whatever else. But basically I would use calories and macros, like that kind of IFYM concept that was developing at that time. Because this would have been like 2010, you know. So I basically used, you know, counting your calories and macros, and I just made out a diet plan. I was like, I eat this for breakfast, I eat this for lunch, blah, 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 you know. And at this time, like I was going to the gym before school, or going for a run, depending. And then I would go to school. So I'd cook my food for like the night before, and then I would do all my stuff, then do my sports in the evening and cook my food, or, you know, my family would cook my food or whatever. And then as I got into like first and then second year of secondary school, or sorry, college, then like that became more of like, oh, I actually just cook my meals. Like I had kind of like given up on sports, not given up on them, but I was like, oh, look, kind of get disillusioned with like my ability to succeed in those sports. So I was like, oh, look, I'm not going to be the next, you know, I don't know, whoever. So I'm not going to do those. Was still going to the gym, probably eating way more than I needed to, because I'd come from like exercising loads, like 2-a-day trainings and whatever else, and also like cycling to school and, you know, all that kind of stuff. And like that basically had gone away. And I was like, all right, like I basically get the Lewis into town to go to college, and, you know, I would either go to the gym. I actually think I used to go to the gym in the evening then, you know, because I didn't want to have to wake up early, you know, to go to the gym. So I go to the gym in the evening, but basically my activity throughout the day was much lower, but I was eating like still similar enough calories. You know, I hadn't really got those concepts in terms of like activity level and calories together. And I was like, oh, I always needed like 4,000, 5,000 calories to, you know, maintain or slightly gain or whatever, you know. So I was still eating that. And like, that's probably the most productive my training has ever been. And it's probably a combination of the fact that, you know, I wasn't doing multiple things, you know, multiple sports or whatever. And also the fact that I was eating like an unreal surplus, right? But like, that was like, I'd say, yeah, probably the most productive of my training. Like I was 115 kilos or something, and like definitely had more muscle than I have now, you know? And obviously like then like I was learning more about like on bodybuilding.com, and I was on like Lyle McDonald's site and which is bodyrecomposition.com in case anyone is wondering, and was learning more information about that kind of stuff, like nutrition and better training methods. And then I really got into like reading like scientific research, and I was like, oh, I actually like want to learn more about this. So I started thinking about this more. And at the time, like I was still working in like gyms and stuff. So like I was learning stuff from people that work there. Again, some of it bro science, some of it not, some of it good, some of it bad. So that was all informing my nutrition. But at no point was I like, oh, you should be eating bad foods like to fit your calories, like I wouldn't, like occasionally if we were like, oh, I'm going out to eat, with my girlfriend or whatever, or drinking, I'd still be like, right, I still need to somewhat be attentive to the calories in the alcohol, because I used to be like, well, I'm a big boy, so I was able to drink quite a lot of alcohol and still not be drunk. So that's not beneficial, in case anyone was wondering. But
It's a disaster.
it's just extra money. And anyway, but yeah, so that was kind of like where I was at. Then I got more and more into it, and I was like, oh, I actually need to track my calories. But there was a stage where I was like, oh, actually, look, I wasn't actually tracking calories, right? I was only just using calories as like, I set my diet. I'd be like, eat these foods. I was like, here's my calories. Write it on a piece of paper. Eat this for breakfast. Eat this for lunch. Eat this for dinner. It was basically like a meal plan based on the calories and macros that I had given myself, and it was still all like, you should eat healthy foods. My concept of what healthy foods was or are changed in terms of I would be reading more content. And this is all the time when like the paleo diet and stuff like was really like being put out. And like, in case anyone was wondering, like, I actually think that's a great concept. Maybe the arguments for it, we could argue all day in terms of like the validity of those arguments, but that's another beside the point. But like I started eating like that kind of framework. I was like, oh, maybe I should try these things. Now, again, it's quite hard when you're trying to eat like 4,000 calories, and it's like, you don't eat these grains, don't eat these. And I'm like, there's only so much potatoes that I can eat. But yeah, I did do that. And again, there was points in time where I wasn't necessarily tracking, but I was still using that kind of like, here is the rough calculations for my diet. I wasn't actually actively tracking daily, and then there was a period of time where I kind of modified that by trying like a very low carb paleo diet. I'm hesitant to say ketogenic diet, because like I was definitely still consuming way too much protein. I was like, protein is good. It's always served me well. Because again, I started in this like, protein is good. It's always served me well kind of mindset where, eat more protein. It's good for you. I was definitely consuming like 300, 400 grams of protein per day, which, isn't actually absurd, because I was like 110, 115 kilos, like, so that's not absurd. But definitely too much. And then I was like, oh, I actually want to diet down. So tried this lower carb paleo approach. Again, hesitant to say it was ketogenic because there was so much protein, but that got me very lean. Was trying intermittent fasting. Still understood that it was all just calorie balance that was manipulating this, but I was still kind of, was I enamored with different diets in terms of, I was like, these are like the secret. This is a fat loss diet, and this is a muscle gain diet, like as if there was like specific properties to the foods, or whatever the way the diet was structured, or whatever it is that gave better results than if you had just tracked your calories and macros. And tried in for intermittent fasting and stuff like that, again with varying levels of like calorie control, in terms of like I would work out my calories and still hit them or whatever. Basically it was just calorie manipulation, but I thought there was some inherent properties to these specific diets, whether it was intermittent fasting or paleo or whatever. And then I'm not really sure when it was. Maybe, I don't know, I could actually find the exact number of days ago it was, but there was a point where I was like, oh, I just want to eat a bit more, or a bit less restrictive, and not have these kind of ideologies around it, and just really hammer home like the more scientific stuff. So I was like, all right, I'm just going to track my calories and macros, and use this IFIM approach that I was hearing about on all these forums and all the stuff that I was reading, and just use that. Like people were like, oh, MyFitnessPal is the way forward. And this was back in the day, and like Facebook was, Instagram wasn't a thing. So Facebook was where people shared information, which is by far and away an extremely better method of sharing information than Instagram. right? Because you can link articles, you can do whatever else. Like I would argue that Twitter is a better place to get information than Instagram, you know, even though everyone uses Instagram and thinks that it's a great place for health and fitness information purely by virtue of the fact that, you know, sex sells. So putting a picture of my shredded body is obviously going to get a lot of following or, you know, likes or whatever on a photo sharing app. But Facebook was great because people were linking these articles and people were like giving rationales for their diets and their ideologies and whatever else. So it was a far better method of learning. So I learned a lot from that. And again, I was like, I just want to track my calories and macros. People are using this IFIM, don't really have a need or desire to eat these kind of crap foods, if you will. But I was like, this seems to be more scientific than what I'm doing. So got more into that. And I'll tell you right now, that was 2,154 days ago, right? So as the time of this recording, which is the 11th of October. And the reason I know that is because I still, to this day,
is it?
whatever it is, I don't know. I still, to this day, track my calories, you know, and there's, again, varying levels of, we'll say, strictness with that calorie tracking in terms of, you know, I'm like, if I know I'm going to eat a meal at the end of the day and I'm like, yeah, I know roughly that I have 30 grams of protein to eat and this meal has about I have 600 calories to eat or whatever it is. And this meal has roughly that. Like, I'm not going to be like, oh, I need to track that, you know, it needs to be tracked, you know. However, I do like having the ability to go back and be like, what was I eating then? How many calories was I on then? You know, what was the results I was getting from that? I like having that data. I like being able to look at that over time, see how my weight has changed, you know, all that kind of data. I like having that data. I like being that more objective. And even though I eat a very, like, I'm not adherent to, you know, really strict calorie and macro tracking, I still like to do it. I like to be like, all right, even if I overconsume, I'm like, I like to have it tracked. So I'm like, I know I can look back and be like, why has this happened? I'm like, I have the data. I can look at it, you know? And also I just don't like well, first of all, I don't want to break my streak. That's a big thing as well. But also I'm like I enjoy it. I think it's very handy to do, you know, like, even though, like Gary was saying there, me and him eat pretty similar in terms of the way we actually eat. I eat way more fish than he does, though, because he's a child. But the actual diet setup in terms of, it's like, this is breakfast. So like, sometimes I'll do intermittent fasting or, you know, whatever, but this is kind of like the setup of my diet: some meat, some vegetables, some carbohydrate, to whatever energetic needs I have, you know, or some added fats or whatever it is to my energetic needs. Like, the diet principle is similar, you know. So you might think like, why don't I just not track calories? Because my diet is very similar day to day. But I like being that little bit more objective rather than being like, yeah, I think that's about this many calories. Like, I like being able to be like, you know what, I'm actually just not going to eat according to the set plan that I normally eat to, in terms of like, I have this for breakfast or lunch or whatever. Like, obviously there's a lot of variety in my diet, but I like being able to be like, you know what, actually I was out, I don't know, at a hotel with my girlfriend, and the next day it's like, you know what, actually we're going to have pancakes for breakfast and eggs or something. I'm like, I like being able to put that into my fitness pal and then still be on track later in the day, you know. I'm like, I don't have to think about it. I don't, like, I just put in the numbers, whatever it is. I'm like, all right, cool, there, we're on track, you know, rather than having to be like, oh, well, you know, maybe that I had a little bit more for breakfast, so I'll have a little bit later here. Like, I'm actually pretty terrible at listening to my hunger cues, because, again, I was fat when I was younger, so they're probably already a little bit skewed towards that. But also, like, my activity is so variable day to day, in terms of, like, before the lockdown I was doing like 2-a-day trainings, you know, because I was like, that's what I grew up doing. I enjoy doing that, you know. I was doing resistance training in the afternoon, and then, you know, Brazilian jiu-jitsu in the evening, you know. And right now I'm doing resistance training in the morning. I'm gone back to that because I'm like, that's a little bit quieter in the gym at that stage, so I'm like, it suits me better. And I like having that kind of, like Gary was saying before, like the kind of bookend to your day of like, do your training in the morning, get straight into work. Like, I like having like 9-10 hours of just straight work to do, you know. Like, I break that up, obviously, like I have meals during that time, or like I'll go for a 30-minute walk, you know, get my steps in, and, you know, stuff like that. Like, it's not just a straight through, but I like being able to do that, you know. But yeah, so like, I'm pretty terrible like knowing like, oh, well, you know, today I'm not too hungry, so I'm going to eat less. But then what happens is I have training in the morning, and then I've 2 training sessions that day. So I was under fueled for that day. So those sessions went poorly. And then I'm like, oh no, like I didn't perform as well. And then that goes into the next day because I don't have time to eat more calories, like me personally, it doesn't suit my lifestyle to not track. I'm like, at least I know if I've tracked. I'm like, I know I'm roughly on target versus not tracking and then having that little question mark in my head, not to say that like that's going, like I'm a star athlete that I'm like, I'm going to be the next big thing or anything. I'm like, just for my own personal enjoyment, I'm like, well, it just takes that guesswork out of it. I'm like, all right, my diet is on point as much as it can be reasonably expected to be because I know, because I've tracked it, So that's where I'm at.
Savage. Lovely stories. So that's how we ate over the last number of years, if people are interested. But I wanted to ask, is there anything that you think was instilled in you, like from your parents, that you think like served you well in terms of nutrition over the years?
I don't know, maybe like my dad grew up in a tenement, so like he didn't have access to food. Like if you ever look at it, I actually slag him about it all the time because like he basically grew up in one of these beautiful Georgian houses, it's like you had a better house back in the day than you do now. He's like, yeah, it was a fucking tenement, it's like 12 of us on the floor, like but I'm like, yeah, but the house looked beautiful. So he was always like overeat rather than undereat, he was like that kind of mentality, which in another context would be bad. That's probably why I was fat as a kid, but it probably served me well in terms of the reason that I'm like over 6'5", the reason that like, I'm good at these different sports and whatever else is like I was eating food, rather than like not eating food. So like that could definitely be construed as a negative, be like almost this food scarcity mindset, like that could definitely lead to like obesity. But for me, it worked out well, because I'm like, it allowed me to do what I wanted to do, Yourself?
Yeah. I think there's probably a few things like that. I think I was probably raised on that mindset as well of like, we'll praise you for eating more, not less, kind of a thing like
I
that. I
think
think
most people in Ireland
that's a
really
very
are.
Irish thing. Yeah.
Maybe it's a famine thing. Maybe it's not. Who knows?
Yeah, I mean, it would make sense, as in like, sit at the dinner table until you finish your dinner.
You're not
That
allowed to
kind.
leave until that plate is clean.
Yeah, exactly. Which mightn't be the best when you're an adult and you're in an environment where there's an abundance of hyperpalatable foods. But I think it's generally like probably, a net positive. Like, look, these are your meals, eat them. Like, don't be being a little fucker, like trying to ask for a chocolate if you haven't even eaten your dinner, that kind of thing. Like, I think that's pretty positive. So yeah, my mom definitely was like that in terms of praise. Even to this day, like she will praise the fact that Gary's a great boy to feed, because it's like you can put anything up in front of me and like that's it, it's done, but yeah, other things, I think like we had like one day per week that was like you get takeaway on this day, like that's it, on a Friday after school, collect you and your sister and we'll go and we'll get McDonald's or Supermax or whatever it happens to be. Like, so it was never a case of like, oh mom, like it's Tuesday, can we get McDonald's? Like, no, that's not a thing. Like, you don't get McDonald's regularly. And I always remember that being actually something that, like, as a child, you're obviously frustrated about, because I remember other kids would get takeaway more frequently and stuff like that. But obviously it does stand to you. And other simple things like, you wouldn't just go into the press or the cupboards, for people who don't call it the press, and just take biscuits or take chocolate or take crisps. Like, you would have to ask, and it would be like a fairly big deal if your mom was like, yeah, go on, take a chocolate bar. Like, that wasn't something that was just in the house. So that would always be a big deal if you went to someone else's house and like their mom let you just have whatever chocolate bar you wanted. You'd be all, you'd be buzzing or whatever. So yeah, there's a lot of those things that are fairly simple lessons that I think do probably stand to you. And I think although when you're a child, you'd love to just be able to have as many treats as you want all of the time, you kind of begin to appreciate when you're older that, yeah, these things are actually good. You need to learn discipline, letting children do whatever they want probably isn't the best thing in the world,
Yeah, like I'd be very similar as well. Like just thinking of it now, like we never had any we didn't get takeaway regularly, because it'd be like I'll go to McDonald's and McDonald's is cheap. Like this is also really annoys me when people are like, oh, food availability, it's so, hard for people. And I'm like, man, like we didn't have enough, like we didn't have a lot of money growing up, and also lots of kids. And well, yeah, okay, a Happy Meal costs like €5 all in. It's like, yeah, okay, there was literally 7 people in my house to feed, and varying times there was 10 people in my house to feed. It's like, you can't just be like, oh yeah, it's real cheap. I'm like, it's definitely far cheaper to feed those people with like food from whatever Dunn Stores or Tesco or Aldi or whatever, rather than going out. Like we never got, like it would have to be like a big treat. Like it would basically be like my dad would be going across to visit all his brothers or something like there on the north side and we're on the south side. But like we'd be going across and it'd be a big day, or like maybe it was, I don't know, a funeral or something, or, a christening or something, whatever the fuck it was, and basically we'd all hop in the fucking big 7-seater car that we had. And we drive across, and then my dad did the cooking in the house because he's an entrepreneur. So he was like at home during the cooking time. My mom had a job, but yeah, so like he'd be like, oh, fuck, I don't want to cook. So that would be the day that we'd be like, get a McDonald's on the way home, and he'd be like, oh man, if you got a McFlurry with your McDonald's as well, like, oh, you must have done something great, so definitely not like that's a positive where it was like, oh, we didn't really eat bad foods. Now, having said that, like I was eating like pizza and chips for dinner, so it's not like, well, it's not like I was like, oh, I was eating like, stew that was made, nice and fresh and whatever else. It was like, no, you're getting like packaged oven chips and, packaged little pizzas, it's like, it wasn't like, oh, whatever. But again, it was like, that's what we could afford. And, so yeah, like it was, there's definitely loads of those things now. I'm thinking back, like you said, like, oh, you definitely don't like reach into the press and just, grab a packet of crisps or whatever. It's like, no, like your parents have to be like, yes, you're allowed. Because again, like there's lots of boys in my house. So if that was the case, man, it would have been pandemonium.
Yeah, one other thing that I think was actually a pretty big deal, especially for me going off to college, was or for anyone, like when you're moving out of home, was that like I always had a packed lunch, even like throughout secondary school. And I think that was actually probably more rare. Like I think the vast majority of my friends in secondary school would have their parents give them a fiver and you go uptown to the shop or whatever. And like, I mean, you can go pretty far in Dunn's with a fiver, because I remember they used to have these packs of cookies and they were like, again, like 39 cents or 29 cents or something like that. You get a whole packet of cookies. So people would get one of those, they get a chicken roll or roll full of sausages or something from the deli or something like that. And maybe like some sweets and a bottle of Coke. And it's like, that's your lunch. So like, obviously then when you go off to college, like that's something you're used to, and suddenly you have your own money and your own freedom. And then that's what you do every day between classes. Whereas I was actually always used to like my mom giving me a packed lunch from primary school to secondary school. And then obviously as I got into the gym, that was positively reinforced because I was like, that's what I want. I actually don't want to be buying stuff in the shop or whatever. So that was a pretty huge thing. As well, I actually used to have one friend, my best friend in secondary school, my mom started making him the rolls that she used to make me for a while. Like she'd give him one the odd time because we used to drop him to school just to be sound. And he's German, like, so he's proper German now. He used to get a fiver from his mom for his lunch. So he'd keep the fiver and wouldn't buy his lunch, and then he'd sell the roll my mom gave him and go hungry and just keep the money. Oh, what a guy.
I was going to say on that as well, like I actually used to get like make a packed lunch myself, but then I'd also go in and just buy a chicken fillet roll at
both.
Like 4th and 5th and 6th year. I was like, of course I'll do both. Like more food is better.
But yeah, that's the life cycle of nutrition for us.
But yeah, it is one of those things where you like, when you look back on it, you're like, how did I actually get to being informed like of my current diet practices and stuff? And as we said at the start of the episode, like it can seem like people come to this and it's like, oh, they just have everything figured out, and like obviously like we're not touching on every single thing that we learned along the way. And like there's been periods of time, like Gary's talked about it before, like he dieted down for a holiday and then binge ate on holiday, and like obviously that's not beneficial.
No.
But like that kind of informs like your practices, like how you coach people in future, how you discuss things with people in future, you're like, okay, well, actually, we're going to have to, that's an issue, you know. And like, obviously, like I write a lot of the nutrition content on our website, and like, hopefully you see those little lessons shine through when you read those things, where it's like, oh, you might experience this. Like, for example, you might go, okay, I've been dieting for X number of weeks, and then I'm going to increase my calories to maintenance. And then you go to maintenance and you're like, oh, wow, actually, I've got this kind of like reactive hunger where, you know, I'm actually hungrier now than I was when I was dieting, you know? And like, they're only little lessons that you learn by going through these different phases, you know, by going through these different diet modalities, or, you know, different things with the diet. And like, hopefully when you read those articles, because you should be reading those articles, hopefully that shines through, and you're kind of like, oh, actually, yeah, like that's something that I would never have thought of, you know. And it's all those little tips and tricks and whatever else, that, you know, they get lost if you don't provide that information. You know, people have to relearn things consistently. Now, again, like, you could read the articles and be like, oh, like reactive hunger, like that's something I need to watch out for. But then when you actually experience it yourself, or, you know, don't experience it yourself, like that still is going to inform how you approach diets in future, you know. So obviously we're skipping over a whole host of different things, being like, right, this is my goal currently, and this is what I ate to get to that singular goal. Or, you know, there's periods of time where I was like, I want to be leaner, or periods of time where I'm like, I really want to push performance, or periods of time where I'm like, I just want to eat healthy foods, you know, or whatever it is, you know. And like that, it can seem like we just come to a consensus, having not traveled down many different paths to get there, you know. So again, if you are a newer coach, or you are someone that is, you know, effectively coaching yourself to, you know, get better nutrition or whatever, like, realize that, like, you're not going to get it right from the start. Like, there's definitely so many things that we still have yet to learn, you know, in terms of like, when we have kids, you know, it's like, how do we eat when we have kids, you know, when there's multiple people in the house. It's like even Gary saying, like I think about this a lot in terms of, I'm like, oh, like, I like to cook my food at the start of the day and like have it laid out for the day. But that's going to be different when, you know, you've kids to feed as well. And it's like, what are you going to cook their dinner? And like, what do you cook them for lunch, and, or make them for lunch? You don't necessarily have to cook it, but, you know, like stuff like that. It's like, and then you want to eat together at the same like time, have the same meals, you know, like there's definitely all these different things that we still have yet to experience. And while we can definitely, you know, hypothesize in terms of like, this is a better approach, and this is what I've seen works, and this is what I've seen doesn't work, because like we've coached hundreds of people in those situations, you know. And obviously we know people in those situations, like we have, you know, families, like my families are always like I say, my families are always like massive. So I've seen this on like a large scale, you know, like the average child, like the average children in like one of my families is like 6 or something, you know, like we have loads of kids basically is what I'm saying, you know. So we're going to outbreed you, in case you were wondering. But basically like have loads of kids. So I've seen this on like a mass scale, and that's obviously informative in terms of how I'll approach having my multiple kids. So yeah, like there's definitely lots still to learn, but yeah.
Yeah, and I think when you talk to most people who've maybe been kind of, let's say, close to a decade of managing their nutrition in some sense, like once you get to that point, you've been through the period of like sampling lots of different things. And I think like you see this in most fields where people have expertise. They like, not necessarily, I'm not, this isn't a political comment, but it's somewhat related. People generally start more liberal and they become more conservative in their approach, in that like when you're early on in your kind of in your approach to nutrition, and your perspective on nutrition, like you're sampling lots of different things. You're very open to the idea that something else could be the right way of doing things. But eventually that kind of narrows in, and you come to this point where you start to eat a diet that's, you know, a bit more consistent, and suddenly it's like, all right, this is the way I've been eating for like 3 years, and it's very unlikely that someone's going to persuade me that, you know, I should totally change my diet. It's just less likely when you've been doing it for that length of time. Like maybe you got completely misled and someone put you on a ridiculous diet and it worked for a while. But for the vast majority of people, I think if you've been like deliberately trying to improve your nutrition for a while, over time, you just get to this point where you start to appreciate the scientific perspective. So for example, like, what does nutrition science say about what a good diet is? Like, you know, you don't have to take on 100% of that, but you're taking it into consideration. But you also consider things like the cultural aspects of diet. Like, so I'm Irish and I'm love like mashed potatoes and spuds in all forms, and thankfully now like steak and gravy and all that sort of stuff. So like they're probably always going to be part of my diet. Like I can't really see that changing. You know, and even things like what takeaways I would go for. Like if I'm in town and I'm going to get some food and I want something convenient, I'm always going to go to Boojum and get a burrito. Like almost always, it's just like, yeah, if I want a snack, let's go. Or even when I come to see you in Dublin, like we always get Nando's or we get Boojum. Like, so it's just, again, we're like real, like boring conservative people. Like, yeah, I know what I like. Let's just stick with it, you know? That doesn't mean you can't still be open to the idea of change. You know, for example, it could be that I eat lots of blueberries in my porridge heated, and there's a study in 3 years that actually says that you lose all of the benefits of blueberries when you have them heated, you know? So I might be like, you know, maybe I'll have them on the side, maybe, you know, but probably not. So yeah, I think that's just something for people who are early on in their career, you could say, to realize, because you do end up in this position sometimes. And we get comments like this from people who say, I just don't know what to do. You know, I've been trying everything. Everyone says something different. And I just kind of say to people that, like, look, everyone that you're listening to, they've all been through this process. Everyone has been in your position. And eventually you start to get to a point where you kind of settle into something that suits you a bit better. But yeah, it definitely takes time. And I think the mistakes are almost like a rite of passage. Like I genuinely don't know anyone who's like from day one, they had everything on point. And sometimes I'm
Were you not
kind of
just
jealous.
listening to my story? I just told you I had everything on point.
But sometimes I'm actually jealous of like some of the clients we work with. Not to say that we put you on the path straight away, but
I
some of the
do.
clients that we work with, you know, if they're beginners and they're able really kind of over the course of, let's say, 6, 9, 12 months working with me or working with Paddy, and they're in a point where like they're where I was at like 5 or 7 years in, I'm like, God, that's a good place to be. But even at that, I still wonder, do you actually need to make all of those mistakes? Because I think that even if that person has got to the point where they feel like they have it all together, they still have to encounter lots of myths and stuff along the way that they'll probably sample. You know, that's kind of just part of the process. So, you know, don't worry about it. It doesn't make you stupid, you know, and I think that's something I'm mindful of myself as well, is that, you know, when we talk about the podcast, sometimes we can be very dismissive of certain dietary ideologies or dietary myths or whatever. And I'll do the same thing on Instagram, being like, oh, this is such a stupid idea. But I also completely like recognize and want to be very open about the fact that I have believed the vast majority of the stupid things that I ridicule now, you know? So yeah, you know, I've had lots of silly nutrition beliefs, tried lots of silly things, and, you know, don't feel like that's a problem with you. It's just, you know, the informational environment that we have. And yeah, hopefully you'll get on the right track eventually.
Yeah, I'm always in two minds about this as well. Like you're saying about these people getting exposed to all this great information early on. You know, I'm like that's actually phenomenal. I'm like, you're so far ahead. And like you see this now, you see like 16-year-olds that are jacked out of their minds and they're like have properly good nutrition and training practices squared away. You know, I'm not saying that they all do everything right, but like I remember when I was like maybe 17, you know, like I had like a 200 kilo deadlift, you know, and that was unheard of. Like people were like, what the fuck? Like that's actually pretty reckless, you know? And nowadays it's like, that's literally just commonplace. You go on Instagram, go to fucking some random 16-year-old and he's pulling like 240 for 5, you know?
Yeah.
So like the exponential growth in knowledge, like and the exposure that people get to it, you know, because of obviously the internet and whatever else. I'm like, it's actually so good. But like you said, it's like you still like I'm kind of like, I don't want to be one of those people. Like I hate the way people are like, oh, like you back in my day, it was like this, and you know, you have to go through some of the hardship to you know be good and whatever else. I'm like I don't really believe in that, but I'm also kind of like, you know, like you can't know what you don't know. So if you didn't experience these things, so it's like you don't know what you don't know. Like it's hard to fully elaborate on that thought, but I'm like, it kind of does inform better practices. And again, I know, like, because I read a lot of history and stuff, people have been saying this shit for millennium where it's like, oh well, you didn't experience what I experienced, so like you can't have this knowledge and whatever else. And like ultimately, like it's led us to this point. So people in the 1950s were saying the same thing, and they were saying the same thing at the turn of the century, and all that kind of stuff where it's like, oh, we're missing something. Oh, tracking your calories, like you're missing some sort of diet quality or whatever it is. But I'm like, it's kind of, I feel great that I'm like, I actually love, and I also love contributing to this, because obviously we have a blog, we have we put out videos, we put out the podcast, we put out content and all that kind of stuff. So obviously we are contributing to that, but I'm also in the mind that I'm like, is it actually harder these days? Are we actually just viewing this as like, oh, it's actually so easy for these kids and because they have all access to this, but they have way more access to shit information that we didn't have to deal with, like I could only read so many fucking magazines, like men's magazines or, diet books that were generally always aimed at, women in their 40s, because that was who bought diet books. And there's only so many I could consume. And now it's like you flick through Instagram or you flick through any social media, YouTube, whatever. It's like, man, you're exposed to so much information that like we can look at it and go, oh yeah, obviously like you've got such great information, but they've actually definitely got way more shit information now as well, and it's easily consumable, and like people get a lot of hype for propagating like just properly shit information, because they're like, oh well, like you have this one weird trick, and everyone else that like you said earlier on is more conservative in their approach, and they're like, oh yeah, it's calories and macros. Once you're aware of those, happy days. And then people are like, oh no, it's this one random little thing that you have to actually look out for, and people want, like they missed out on that kind of more liberal phase. So now they're kind of like searching for extra stuff, so I don't know. It's hard to see where things will go in the future, or whether they have it easier or harder now. But I definitely do enjoy the fact that we can coach people and be like, all right, let's put you on the path, and have someone that's literally been in the gym a year or whatever, and they're like, man, you're probably more jacked than I will ever be because you've had such a good exposure from the start.
Yeah, I think to your point, I think for trainers and people working with people, I definitely think it's probably superior to have made all the mistakes and gone through all those, you could say, rites of passage, because especially if you're someone who like actually puts out information, you've already had to wrestle with all of the ideas already. Like for example, if you've been a hardcore low carber for a while and you've like recovered so you're now someone who like understands all the common arguments in the low carb community, let's say, then you actually understand them way better, and you understand why someone would get into like believing all this stuff and saying that low carb is the only way or whatever, and now you're actually stronger for it. It's actually made your argument stronger because you've believed them, because you've had to really wrestle with them. And I think another thing like that, I've been actually speaking with one of my clients who's a coach, a relatively new coach. I've been speaking with him about it recently, is he's someone who's almost always like never had any issue losing weight. Nutrition has never really been a problem for him, because if he just eats to his appetite, he just loses weight, no problem. And recently what we've been doing is we've actually been trying to get him to a point that's beyond that. Like he wanted to really diet down and get proper lean. And basically along the way, he's been starting to encounter those experiences, maybe wanting to eat a little bit more, or go off track, or have some extra food, go have a little bit of a binge or whatever, those types of things, and experiencing the hunger and experiencing the bit of fatigue, and all of those things actually help him then as a coach, because he's not that he's making mistakes, but he's at least experienced the downside of that process. And I think if you haven't experienced things for yourselves, it's difficult to advise on it. And that even goes for information. I think, if you've encountered all of the arguments about clean eating or keto or low carb generally, or the paleo diet, etc., and you've done them all yourself, then when someone comes to you and they say, hey, what are your thoughts on the paleo diet? You're now in a position where you can actually say, yeah, I actually, I came across all these arguments before. I actually tried this diet for a while. Here are some of the pros. Here are some of the cons. And here's some things that I think you could work on. And it actually gives the person a solution, rather than, and I think this is very common nowadays. Again, we sound like old men, like in our 20s, but
I am an old man.
when people are, let's say they kind of grew up as trainers with that school of thought of just, oh, it's calorie deficit, calories, macros, boom, and that you think you have nutrition sorted, then when a client comes to you with maybe a novel argument from, let's say, the low carb community, or the why you should do a paleo diet or whatever, then you actually never had to even think about that, and you think it's new. You're like, oh, is this new? I thought, all I've ever been exposed to is this idea that it's kind of calories and macros and stuff. Like, what's all this about? And you might say, oh, that's all a myth, but you didn't actually think about it. You didn't actually, look into it, because you were only just thinking that this is my worldview. So there's pros and cons, because obviously if you're giving someone the right information, like, there you go, that's fine. But I definitely think there is something to having made the mistakes along the way, especially if you're a trainer. I don't know if you're just an everyday person. Like, if you just eat less, eat less junk, and eat more fruits, vegetables, lean meats, etc. Like, you're still going to get healthier.
Yeah, and again, as I was saying earlier, like there is always this concept of what's old is new and what's new is old. It's like
Yeah.
it's just this constant cycle of like, and again, it can be really confusing when people come to different diets that are just repackaged old information. Like people, again, they think that IFYM is some magical thing. It's like, oh well, it's only in the last like 20 years we'll say that people have been really like been able to track their calories and stuff. I'm like, if you actually dig back into this, people were doing this at the turn of the last century, like 1900. Like you think because you have your app that does it for you. It's like, no, people were doing this before then. They used to have little log books with different food amounts, with different calories and stuff in them. It's like the method has changed, but we had the information. This is not new information. People are like, oh, calories and macros, blah blah blah. I'm like, mate, this is literally 120 years old at least. It's like, this is not new information. It might be new information for you, or how it's presented might be new information, but it's not new information. And again, people have been eating forever. So
Yep.
like they've been navigating the diet, and maybe that's just navigating food availability, which was nil at times, but they've been navigating it and making things more or less beneficial for their goals. But yeah, it's interesting when you think about this stuff. But like you said, I do think that a bit of challenge in people's lives, especially coaches, like I think that actually does go a long way in terms of
For sure.
actually making you a better coach. Like if you've never experienced challenge, and again, like this is one of those things that like challenge is good pretty much across the board, because most people don't experience actual challenge and hardship in their lives these days. Like obviously it's like, oh well, like you have to get a job and you have to do whatever, and maybe they do experience some like financial challenge, especially like this year. But like you see what's come out of it. Like even if you look at like the number of companies that are made, like have been made in America this year, like they're up like by thousands. So like once, like hardship is like the mother of invention. They always say like war is the mother of invention, but it's like that's just hardship to the extreme. Like any hardship will do it, so I think a little bit of hardship, whatever that is, like even if it's just challenging yourself, being like, right, I start training weight class athletes, I'm going to become a weight class athlete myself. It's like that helps. It actually puts some like skin in the game and makes you be like, all right, cool, I actually have to experience what these people are experiencing as well. And again, like obviously, like you can't have all of the experiences in the world.
Yeah.
Like you just simply can't. Like I'm never going to be pregnant. you know so like there is obviously that aspect of it where you can still discuss information even if you don't have the experience with that specifically. You can have experience, we'll say, adjacent to that. Like I've coached people that are pregnant. I have sisters that were pregnant. Again, like people in my family like to have lots of kids, so pregnancy has been around a lot of the time that I've been alive. And so like there's obviously experience there and you pick up different things, but I'm never actually going to physically feel what it feels like to be pregnant. So basically what I'm saying is, yes, you should have some hardship in your life, and experience is great. It's not the be all and end all, but it definitely is additive.
Yeah, and I think like one tip for people there as well is like there are obviously some cases where you simply can't get experience. Like for example, if you grew up in a really wealthy household, you know, a lot of the things people will say is, oh, I'll never understand what it's like for people to, you know, live in with low socioeconomic status, or to grow up in a housing estate like we did or whatever. But like the research is there. Like, you can actually read qualitative research on this stuff, which is actually quite interesting in some cases. And like I read quite a bit of it as it relates to physio and pain and stuff like that, because I think it's interesting. But qualitative research is basically a type of research where, rather than trying to like quantify things, like let's say, for example, saying fasting blood glucose or whatever, you're basically asking the person about their experience, or that's part of it. So for example, if someone grew up in, let's say, a housing estate and they had significant financial strain, and you know, you can actually read about like what's their level of nutrition education. So then you're not left saying things like, oh, you know, these people just don't know what to eat, you know, they don't know what healthy foods are. Because if you actually read the research and like qualitative research, you see that, oh yeah, people actually do know what healthy foods are. Like, people are not, you know, that stupid. People know that you should eat more fruits and vegetables and stuff. So you can kind of outsource experience, or at least understand someone else's perspective from reading qualitative research. But at the same time, again, I will never know what it feels like to menstruate. You know, it's not going to happen. I can read qualitative research on that, and you know, I can speak to women in my life, etc. But yeah, I won't ever have to feel it, I don't think.
Fair. I thought you were a woman this whole time, but all right. Anyway, I have nothing else to say on this topic. Well, I actually have multiple other things that we could say on this topic, but you know, there's a time limit to how long I can actually spend looking at you, Gary.
Yep.
So where can people find us, etc., all that stuff?
Yeah, as always, guys, number of things you could do to engage with us. If you are a coach and you would like to move up in the world in terms of upskilling and learning about things like anatomy, how you can apply it to exercise, learning about applied coaching case studies, getting coaching documentation to make the coaching process more efficient, having cues that you can put straight into your exercise programs, learning about nutrition theory and how to coach it, etc. All that stuff is available in the Coach's Corner, which is our membership site for coaches / personal trainers, whatever you prefer. And also interested trainees. You know, some people have asked us that. I've got a message on Instagram this week asking, you know, oh, is it just for coaches, or can I join up if I'm interested? And of course, you can join up if you're interested. And there's also like a couple of physios in there, people who I know who are studying nutrition, one or two who are practicing nutrition but not personal training. So yeah, there's absolutely scope in there for you to just join up if you're just interested in these things. It is information with implementation. There are additional things that are specific to coaches, but ultimately the information is useful regardless. So you can sign up to that, linked below. If you just like to kind of keep up with the content that we are producing in terms of our articles, our podcasts, etc., and also the weekly essay or post that we put out in the newsletter, you can subscribe to the Triage Method newsletter, which you'll find linked below. We also share like resources that we think might be helpful beyond our content there. So that's a nice reason to sign up, even if you don't like us, you know, that's fine. You can subscribe to the Triage Method community as well, or join the Triage Method community, I should say, which is our open access Facebook group. So, you know, people engage with us there asking questions. You know, we had a question recently about, you know, someone had, you know, developed knee pain during the course of a training cycle. Someone else wanted to get advice on training towards a half marathon while keeping around his muscle mass. So like, these are the types of things we deal with in that group. We'll answer your question, no problem. And if it's something that we think is worth answering on the podcast, we'll do that as well. And we also share any articles that we've written recently in there. We don't always put them straight on our social media because we kind of just strip them out over time or share them on the newsletter. But that's a good place to make sure you're on top of everything that we're putting out. If you're someone who's just like wants to, as we said, skip all the bullshit and get on the path to, you know, improving your diet and improving your training, we do have coaching spaces available. So if you'd like to work with myself or Patty, you can do that. Again, as always, we cater to a number of goals, and I think a common theme across our coaching practice is that we try to get people to overcome kind of the bullshits and the bullshit and the fads, etc., so that you don't have to go through those things. And we actually try to, you know, get you to a point where your diet and your training is actually appropriate for your current lifestyle, and that it's going to be sustainable for years. That's mainly one of the main things that we look for. So yeah, if that's you, then you can sign up for coaching. Other than that, of course, we have social media platforms and a YouTube channel. You can find us on Triage Method on YouTube. You can find us at Triage Method on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. Would recommend following on Twitter. We are going to do kind of one post per week that is a little bit longer form, that is specific to Instagram. So if you're not following there, I would recommend that you do so. But other than that, I think that is everything that we have to offer you. And as always, if you'd like to promote the podcast, we always appreciate it when you share it in your story on Instagram. So do that. It's probably the best platform for sharing things. But you know, if you want to share it on Facebook, share it on Twitter or whatever, do it, you know, and leave a review, and we'd really appreciate that.
And it is, as always, too easy.
Too easy.